So I'll be speaking from the perspective of design today, and I would like to argue that futurity is at stake in many design arguments and practices. The future, as a rhetorical device and as a type of practice, pervades contemporary design. Whether in the communication material or promotional bodies such as the British Design Council or the World Design Organization, the World Design Capitals, the future is nearly ubiquitous. Also, in the name of education programs, I've counted at least the word futures in at least upwards of 10% of the courses in some design programs in universities. So obviously the future in this sense is a rhetorical device or promotional device in many ways, rather than an operational or intellectual concept in a way. And it's intended to evoke and provoke new imaginaries for it, imaginaries of and maybe markets for transformation, innovation, the new. These languages have particular persuasive and evocative purposes. Narratives, imaginaries, markets, and so on. Indeed, as Nina Wakeford has noticed, design is just one of the many disciplines affected by the increasing hegemony of particular political economic narratives of progress. We've been kind of discussing that in various ways, or development. So behind these terms, behind this rhetoric, there are assumptions, there are politics, there are normativities or critiques in many ways. Noticeably missing from such rhetoric around kind of temporal rhetoric in design are less desirable notions such as chance, indeterminacy, and the untimely. Beyond mere promotion, scholarship in design and design research, as I argue, must further interrogate its narratives and concepts behind these kinds of concepts. As well, the kind of governmentalities or politics and power impulses behind the use of these kind of languages. For me, this kind of interrogation is crucial to the disciplinary development of design, which has only recently become academicized and formulated as a discipline. John Thackara argues, for example, that design as it emerged during the Industrial Revolution is so closely or even exclusively bound up to certain economic and technical conditions of capitalist production that it's difficult to locate a basis for challenge or change. So this is a project of mine in design, to build up this more critical and kind of interrogative mentalities and concepts. But beyond this, beyond design, as design allies with, for example, future studies and other disciplines, as it's actively doing in emerging subfields such as transition design or design futures, there's a further need to relate critically to discourses in those fields. And there's a danger I would also see in uncritical engagement of design with economic technocentric approaches and future studies, without identifying other possibilities or other modes of critical or political engagement between design and future studies among, for example, other areas. So for example, with my futures research colleague, we've been discussing how different varieties or genres within future studies could be productive for design and design research, and critiqued each of us respectively in our respective fields against imaginaries of the future as technological and material only, portraying the future as a discrete and definite location or place. A place that might be arrived at or colonized through linear transition pathways, along which the development of particular technologies are the privileged baseline for plotting human, cultural, and societal progress, in which the social, much less the intersectional, much less ecological factors are considered at all. So it's for me a way to start thinking about concepts in common between fields, and a way for looking for opportunities, not necessarily between the mainstreams of each fields, but perhaps on the fringes as well. And I would argue that this interrogation is important beyond design, particularly given the design turn, which many have written about. Here's an article in German and a critique from my colleague Cameron Tonkinwise, the way that design is becoming a kind of synonym for innovation, a synonym for the application phase of basic science, and a term, even a set of policies that universities are using to do more applied, more practice-based, more industry or societally engaged research and activities, the design turn. So this paper, which I'm going to be developing today, takes off from that starting point. It does not match terribly well with the abstract that's in your booklet, nor with the title that's on the slide, partly because I was originally going to talk quite a lot about the field of design for policy, but the project in which I'm working on that progressed slightly differently since I wrote the abstract. And also I'm engaged in a project around the design turn with colleagues Claudia Morais and some others in Germany and Switzerland around the notion of design and governance. So I've tried to actually smush together a few different papers in this, which means it's a bit of a collage. My terminology is very inevitably imprecise, and let's see if the argument follows through, and I will take this learning and whatever you comprehend and do not comprehend into revising for the eventual paper. Okay, so my paper will fall kind of along these kind of stages. I'm going to talk first about design and kind of in brackets the future, and specifically design as a discipline, not only in terms of its spatial heritage or spatial form, but also in terms of time and temporality. And for me, a specific mode or realm or register of temporality is futurity. And I've conceptualized that in a particular way in terms of within temporal form. And the last that I'll touch on more than anything will be about this kind of design for policy implications in a way. So design as a young and emerging discipline for many might be understood as a matter of space, of materials, of objects, of the built environment, spatial matters. So what many might ask, does design have to do with time and the future? Indeed, as philosopher and feminist theorist Elizabeth Gross articulates, space has engendered many discourses and practices, architecture, urbanism, geography, and geology, which might be understood in part or even primarily as occupied with the study, articulation, and regulation of space. And indeed, many practices, many fields within design are preoccupied, some almost exclusively, with spatial and material matters. This is also a legacy from the modern project, the Bauhaus as an institution, how it codified, named, divided up the notion of design, art, and architecture and craft into specific sub-disciplines named, for example, after particular materials, after particular types or scales of space. And the Bauhaus model has been exported in all sorts of interesting ways as a template for design education around the world. So here we can say that we have a lot of kind of design disciplines, design practices named after a space or materials or two or dimensional kind of spatial scales. So these are typical specializations or even departments within a design school, design department, or art school. Nonetheless, even such two- and three-dimensional design can be profoundly concerned with temporality and the future, and I bring a historical example for that. This is the first manifesto of Swedish modern design from 1931, Acceptera. These are the authors, for the most part, and it's a manifesto that unfolds over many pages through both text and image. And I have just extracted a few images from that here. It's reprinted in this source you can see in the citation here. And what's interesting is you can see some kind of logic related to futures in here. For example, they contrast an A Europe, which they envision as a standardized society where industrialization happens at all levels, from large-scale communications to local farming, leisure activities, and even domestication work, the standardization of domestic work. And they contrast this to B Europe, Europe then, Europe past, stuck with regressive cultures and kind of undesirable values. And here you see also some of the judgment coming in about which cultures and what progress and whose bodies are progressive even. So acceptare is a manifestation for the development in a very predetermined direction from B to A, for example, specific era of time leading to a particular A future, particular singular future. And the manifesto kind of lays this out in quite elaborate detail, all the way to what you actually might identify with as modern design, modernist design. This is 1931. It's also the landmark exhibition of modern design, where the tubular steel furniture and all of these icons of modern design, but also modern architecture and modern urbanism, found their kind of expo for the first time. So you see here new ways of the old city to the new city, where there's a different relation to nature, also collective habitat, the rationalization of urbanism, the division of programmatic elements, the invention of the suburbs, and so on. Also, the interior of these houses were built in a very specific way to discourage multi-generational families and to encourage the nuclear family with very specific division of labor in the home, which is also highly gendered. And these apartments are built literally to govern a particular desirable family type, which today the Swedes, given that the suburbs and the standardized housing are largely often in demand or the exclusive option of immigrant families, which may live in and need a very different kind of relation to one another, gender relation to nature, and so on. So these are, in some ways, a kind of, the future is an object design, in this case, a very specific future. And this is also, I should say, acceptare was not just a design authored manifesto, it was published by the publishing branch of the Social Democratic Party. It was a party political document, not only a design object or design manifesto. Very explicit politics, which governed the bodies and governed the peoples, the cultures, the nature, and so on within the city. And in fact, was highly influential, as traced by in fact, I'm missing a reference here. Wallenstein and Mattsson, their architectural history of the Swedish welfare state and the role that design and architecture played in materializing specific party political ideals and visions of the future. So in this way, I want to point out that design is doing a kind of governmentality, a kind of futuring by shaping imaginaries, but also by literally shaping bodies in this work. And that follows along with many other ways since then that architecture and urbanism, interior design, even product design has been studied in terms of its disciplinary functions, how it disciplines the body, how it genders in various ways. You can think on the urban scale of critiques of Haussmann's design of Paris, which was anti-revolution, very specifically to survey and suppress the French Revolution. Robert Moses's urban planning for New York, which was built along racial lines in terms of access, transportation, and so on. Literally, the height of the bridge limits public transportation to certain parts and certain races, the city, and so on. And also Mike Davis's Ecologies of Fear in LA, how architecture is used to discipline, to segregate, to privilege, to make invisible, or to suppress people, behaviors, beliefs, and so on. So spatial form can do that. Spatial form can have temporal elements, including the ongoing beliefs and bodies and behaviors in a way. But since that modernist moment, we also have in postmodernist times and postmodernist design discourse engaged beyond the object and more explicitly engaged with theories of time, change, transformation, and so on. And this is where John Thackeray comes in, where he brought together many different kind of thinkers in the area of post-industrial design to start breaking away from object centrism and hardware as objects in terms of software processes of computation and communication. So the question of form in this postmodern moment is not only one of packaging technology or discrete objects or truthful materials, but it became also the design of information networks, communication systems, spatial morphologies, all sorts of spatial complexities, informational complexities, which interwove with societal and cultural complexities in theories such as chaos, cybernetics, cellular automata, but also studies of cultures of plurality and difference, protest and transgression, populism and consumerism. So in architecture, more temporally, even in architecture, more temporally infused discourses are roved around non-plan, also typology, the building up of elements out of smaller elements, and infrastructuring. And those were notions of spatial and temporal form that operated at collective scales of use, historical scales of time, and dealt with and even took on issues of unpredictability, of protest, of social praxis, as well as spatial syntax, and so on. And that's when other and new design disciplines, such as interaction design, which is my starting point after architecture, that's when interaction design emerged in those discourses of computation, communication, and so on and so on. Let's see how my time is. So even in the terminology interaction design, the term interaction implies time. As originally used to describe reciprocal influence in the physical sciences and then as taken up in the social sciences to describe interpersonal communication. We can say that interaction in my area of interaction design, which is literally the design of computational objects and devices, my phone, which I was hoping to use as a prop, these are devices that interaction designers make. And in these kind of devices, which are combinations of biological, mechanical, chemical, computational, all sorts of different kinds of, I would call, materials are composed, combined, or even composite in these kinds of artifacts. And these kind of artifacts of interaction design are premised on properties that are not even primarily spatial. That phone is extremely small. What it does, the meaning behind it, is how it appears, how it is operational, how it functions, how it performs over time. So there's a very different notion as hardware shrinks and processes extend over time. So we had already in ubiquitous computing and the disappearing computer program of FP5 in the European Union, computation disappears entirely, but their properties emerge and can be affected over time. So a light bulb is not only a piece of glass, it's that, but it's also my phone itself, which is a very different set of materials to do a similar function. So in my doctoral dissertation, which is here at the bottom, I theorize interaction design in terms of occupying time, and I kind of bridge theories in architecture and design, or interaction design, in terms of time and how even not only occupation physically, but also the kind of governance of time becomes central to how we think about designing, scripting, using, for example, interactive objects such as phones, computers, smart cars, smart environments, smart lighting systems, and so on. So as Ezio Manzini argued, we were designing a new generation of objects that, rather being solidly located in space, tended to flow through time. let's see. And the space-time of such objects, of such system, extends well beyond the micro to the global. Today, we see new practices emerging, such as information architecture. Algorithmic design is a highly paid profession nowadays. And so we can say that actually design has expanded from the more temporally preoccupied framing of practices to more temporally oriented notions of what it is that we're designing. We design interaction with a computer, interaction in many ways. We design experiences, game design. These are all things that potentially fall under the purview of design, including emerging fields of transition design, design futures, and so on. So here we have new environments, or very familiar environments, that are kind of mixes of old and new designed things. So we have very spatial designs like the urban environment, the street here, the whole systems of objects and signs and 2- and 3-dimensional forms at human scale, but also at very large scales. And we also have integrated into those communication systems behind the traffic lights, payment systems in the metering, or also the taxation zones, for example, within a city. Within a car, there's a highly complex set of sensors, for example, to buckle your seatbelt, all sorts of highly sophisticated computation, as well as physical and material forms are combined or composed in this. How William Mitchell said in 1987 was that combinations of atoms and bits are programmed together at micro and macro scales in these new kind of artifact to artifact systems. And these authors, Sibley and Cavici, have theorized that in terms of the regulatory power of both spatial and, I would argue, temporal design. These are complex, very familiar, habitual, even cognitively absorbed practices that are shaped by these material and immaterial infrastructures, such that when you go to another country and drive on the wrong side of the road, we have forgotten that we have adhered to the laws, to the regulations, to the expectations that have been programmed into us, or scripted, in Madeleine Ackrich's words, scripted into us by design, in a way. So in this way also, we're foreshadowing for futurity, the way that the future is already predicated on these really enduring forms, but also on these cognitions, on these behaviors, on these cultural practices, which are also, you can say, designed into us, and which lead in various pathways to various possible futures, which are more or less difficult to change. So in this way, I would argue that interaction design thus extends the scope of design even further into the time and space of future use, and therefore interaction design and our temporally oriented design disciplines have a larger future impact, and therefore responsibility over what kind of futures we are already occupying, because we're sedimenting and we're literally materializing these things, which will not go away quickly. And for example, this is also a shift. Barbara Adam has discussed the kind of temporal regimes that are already built into or the heritage of many of the practices, but also many of the spaces and temporal devices that we have today. Paul Virilio has talked about how control societies are taking over from spatial disciplinary societies into the kind of unlocatable and ultra-rapid controls that work beyond sensory perception, beyond the material and spatial form, beyond the human scale at all. So in my work, moving to the second part of my presentation here, I've been trying to find concepts and ways to articulate this temporal concern, and also the politics and power and implications of that in various ways. And so I'll talk a little bit about temporal form and futurity. So I've more specifically conceptualized interaction design, but also many temporally relevant to many design disciplines and even beyond design in terms of temporal form. And with my colleague Johan Redström and many around us, we have been really trying to decouple design with material and space to processes. For example, processes of formation, that it's not the material or the space that we're shaping or giving form to. It's actually the way that those evolve, unfold, devolve, disintegrate, disassemble over time. And all of those potentialities or virtualities can be anticipated and possibly programmed into objects. For example, you can imagine design for disassembly and different strategies that we can have with very different potential future implications, for example, in life cycles and so on. And when I say temporal form, it's not to oppose a spatial to a temporal order, but to draw attention to the complex interrelations in between. And in this way, also potentially to build some grounds for common conceptual grounds between architecture, computational fields, even fields of social and cultural change, transition management. Temporal form is a way to possibly describe the way something forms or comes to be or becomes in a way that might be useful across several fields. Yes. Okay, so so for me, this notion of futurity is some aspect, let's see, yeah, of latent in. What we heard earlier about the kind of latent futures, or also Barbara Adams, the present futures, the future presents, which I would argue are kind of implicit, whether we intend them or not, in these kind of artifacts. There is the future is not empty. There are many aspects of the future which are given by the things already here in the present, including the forms that we are that great material and economic investment has sedimented around us. And this notion of futurity, for me, is a contrast to the notion of the future in a way that I find to be quite useful for various reasons. Partly because it helps me align with more critical approaches to the future, for example, of feminist and post-colonial theory, which may critique time as structured in three categories of past, present, and future, that tripartite ontology of time, which is relatively recent, modern, and Western. So Hel Inyatula says that this tripartite ontology of time is not universal. Different cultures, different spiritual cosmologies actually do not recognize the future and this way of organizing time. Indeed, Barbara Adams has also a critique from a feminist perspective of the way that this particular notion of time, and time as measurable, and time as commodified, is a kind of artifact of the Industrial Revolution in various ways. So we don't necessarily, and we can think about futurity also be in another way than without necessarily subscribing to the future and all of those kind of implications. And I just wanted to point to another kind of future visioning or image of the future that in fact builds on magical realism rather than the notion of scenario or future at all. This is the work of Jakowski and Ostos, which looked at the mass flooding by governmental regimes in China and South America, looked at the floodplains, looked at the communities, cultures, populations displaced by those, the communities decimated by those, and particularly the family implications of that, both the productive aspects but also the particularly feminine concerns of home and food and so on, which were literally kind of flooded. And they reimagined, based on that data and the particularly affected peoples and practices, another kind of architecture, which in fact is also not stable, but living and is woven and is alive and breathes in a completely other way, according to the kind of local cosmologies of how the bridge between nature and artifact or artifice, in a way. So they have a living architecture as a figure of thought in contradiction to this mass industrial project of flooding and colonization and so on. So if we do choose to work with notions of the future, I find it very useful to think, oh gosh, okay. I find it very useful to think about the future as something else or something other. So obviously we've already talked about the epistemological problem of the future. Data about the future is hard to come by, so that horizon is already very difficult to think of in the same way as the present or the past. So I like to think, for example, as Elizabeth Grosz suggests, as the future as an other or an outside. And in that way, it operates in the present not as something to arrive at, as a place in time, a definite location that can be reached through a linear pathway in that sense, but more as or figurations or figures of thinking to provoke change, discussion, deliberation, debate in the present. And in that I'm aligned with participatory and culturally informed futures studies, for example, as opposed to positivist and technocentric model of future studies, which have a slightly different purpose and logic. And in that way, I'm interested in questions not like how well do you know that future, how is your knowledge or evidence for that future in that scenario, but what difference does that future make? How does it make us think differently about now, or what do those different futures do in terms of how we think, how we discuss, how we can redirect our practices in the present? And so in that way, gosh, I have miscalculated my time here. So I will go to a couple of examples in which we've been working with futures in this way. This is a design project, very, very old one by now. I think it's from 2010, in which we use the kind of energy gas prices crisis of the time, scanning for local emergent practices, scaling them up, but also taking them as potential movements or signals of different futures. We did a kind of a stakeholder work with winners and losers, and we also kind of mapped out different possible scenarios and created a series of what we called superfictions, where we had a series of different artifacts which were presented as if they were real today. In fact, some of them are. These plugs up there are objects of eco-disobedience used in France for literally turning off the power and short-circuiting the power of shopping malls, which overconsume in eco-disobedient movements' eyes and waste power. So some of these are real and are existing practices. We have some eco-bullet solutions in the aesthetics of cable television and flyers in your mailbox. We have new Earth Day rituals and religions. We have a new media weather forecast for a future in which power only comes when the sun or the wind is on. So these are quite extreme, not some scenarios, but sort of stories of the future in various ways. But for us, what was important is that these don't stay as visions or artifacts, but that they are unfolded in narratives that involve people hands-on in imagining themselves in those futures or their children. We wrote, in fact, a whole script, stories from the future around these artifacts, and invited different stakeholders to imagine themselves personally in these futures, but also in their professional roles. How would architecture be different if there were rolling blackouts, and if overconsumers of energy were taxed at a different rate than those who lived a degrowth lifestyle, and so on. So in this way, we're actually able to test out these different possible, even energy scenarios or energy futures, from eco-modernism to degrowth in various ways. And I will just point to one more example, and I will actually stop there and leave for a future discussion my third point. But this is another project which doesn't lay out very alternate scenarios, very alternate kind of universes of winners and losers, but a very particular normative future. This is a project called Stockholm 2030, written as a alternative to Stockholm's actual Vision 2030, which is meant to attract investment to Stockholm, appeal to tourists. Its brochures are full of Benetton-like ads with much less colorful people, but always happy. And in fact, they developed a very different set of scenarios, practices, and urban planning locations, but also options based on J.J. Gibson Graham's feminist post-capitalist notions, and working directly with her, as well as feminist futurist and political ecology ideas. And then they portrayed these not in the glossy space age technocentric, but in a very also different aesthetic style. And those messages are implicit in this. So you can see even that the animals and the plants in some of these speak. Children are present and have voices, even in the foreground. And animals, this is also a debate in Sweden, the rights and the future of animals and their voice, for example, in political processes. This is actually a trope in environmental STS in Sweden, and so on. So how do we imagine and combat an existing narrative and future with another? And specific locations for debating with politicians and urban planners. And that's where I'll stop. We can take for discussion from there, I think. Yeah, what to do beyond the images, what to do beyond the scenarios. And these are some fields or interdisciplines that are starting to do things like that. I think also the prefigurative practices and so on are other ways of thinking about those things. Yeah, I'll leave it there.